Welcome to Pods with Posh and Pool, a podcast designed to inspire and challenge listeners through story, experience and insight. To face adversity, learn from suffering and discover how to embrace life with a heart filled with love and gratitude. We are so thrilled to have you journey with us and can't wait to share your stories. Join Sue O'Callaghan and Joanne Webb as we disrupt the theory that everyone has perfect lives.
Today, we are going to talk about the lovely topic of forgiveness.
Yeah, I don't like that topic.
Don't you?
No, I think it's hard. It's really good. It's really good. It's challenging. When you first learn about it for the first time, I actually think it's a really hard concept to get your head around. When you kind of understand it, it's okay. But when you first try and grasp it, I think it's a pretty hard topic.
It is a hard topic, and I'm going to come in straight away with the quote. We normally do the quotes later on, don't we? But I'm going to come into it because I think this really emphasises forgiveness and why it's important. As I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. And that was Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela is amazing, isn't he? Because he always says resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. And it's so true. And if there's anyone better to talk on the subject of forgiveness, it would have been Nelson Mandela, wouldn't it?
I know, and he came out of prison and he didn't hold on to that resentment. He lived his life when he came out. You know, he'd been incarcerated for so long, unjustified, and he did not hold on to that bitterness. He allowed forgiveness into his heart. And did he do that for his captors? Did he do that for the people that didn't treat him very well? No, he did not. He did that for himself, because what would have been the point of him coming out of prison, seeing those gates of freedom, yet in his mind still staying in prison? And that's where we are in life. Often it's in our head and our mind. We end up staying in these dark places. And it is a really hard concept to grasp, but we have the choice to not do that. It is so empowering. It is our choice. If you want to live in anger, bitterness, resentment, confusion, hate, rage, that's a choice. But to me, those words, even when you say those words, they don't bring good energy to my soul as I say them out loud. If you want to live in peace, grace, ease, flow, beauty, acceptance, then that's a choice. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, it is. And that, I think you've hit the nail on the head, because there's a misconception about what forgiveness is. And the misconception is, if I forgive my perpetrator, if I forgive the person that raped me, if I forgive my parent that abused me as a child, if I forgive my friend that went off with my other friends, then I'm letting them off the hook and I'm saying that what they did was okay. But actually it's not doing that. It's actually letting yourself off the hook from carrying the bitterness and the rage and the anger and the hurt, as you say. And I looked up the interpretation of forgiveness, what it means, and it says it's actually a conscious decision. So first of all, we have to be making a conscious decision. It's not something that happens overnight or just suddenly evolves. We make a conscious decision to release the feelings of resentment or bitterness towards a person who has harmed us, regardless of whether they deserve to be forgiven or not. And I think that's quite crucial. We make a conscious decision that no matter what's happened to us, we release them from the power they have to alter our life and put our life into the negative space as opposed to the positive. And I had really interesting story. I used to work in prison and I used to teach restorative justice. And we had amazing people that used to come in and work with the girls in prison, teaching forgiveness and what it meant. And some of these girls had never, ever been forgiven in their life. They'd never walked through forgiveness from their parents. They'd never received forgiveness. So they didn't understand the concept of what it was. And least of all, they'd never actually forgiven themselves for anything they'd ever done wrong. And we had this one story of a couple that had a 15-year-old son who was out at night, and he was beaten up by 14 young men in their 20s in the streets, and he was left for dead. And it was a horrific story. He was left for dead on the brow of a hill, and a car came over, and the exhaust pipe of the car picked up the belt from his body and dragged him along the road. And the coroner said it was the car that killed him in the end, but if he hadn't been left for dead on the road, he wouldn't have been there. So their story of their suffering was the worst that any parent could ever go through. And they decided that when this case went to court and the young men appeared in the High Court in London, that they would be present, they'd hear the story, and they watched them, come in and out every single day for a period of weeks. And they chose to forgive the boys, and they chose to forgive the boys' parents that sat there as they listened to this horrendous evidence. And they started to go and visit these young men in prison, and they started then to befriend these young men in prison, and they started to work with forgiveness, the power of forgiveness. And so when they came into the prison I was working in to teach what it meant to forgive, all the girls in front of me, there was probably about 12 in the room that we were working with at the time, the big huge girls, pierced everywhere, tattoos everywhere, swearing, and quite aggressive in nature, they all broke and they cried and they sobbed when they heard the story. And that was the beginning of them being able to understand what forgiveness was. They could see that this couple were not held trapped in anger and rage. They had such love in their hearts. And to witness that when they were all in prison themselves for murder, all these girls had committed murder, that started to transform their lives. The power in forgiveness was so huge. It didn't just affect the parents' life, but it then went on to affect those girls in prison that had also murdered.
It's a huge, huge thing, and forgiveness is for the strong. So don't ever think by forgiving somebody that you are the weaker party. That is not the case whatsoever. It shows how strong you are when you can do that. I mean, the love in those people's hearts, that couple's heart who could go and do that. And then they turned their pain and suffering into something good for the world. They went out and passed on their message, and they led by example. And we're always talking about that. We all need mentors. We all need to be shown how to do something, because we don't come into this life just knowing stuff. Okay, we know the odd thing, but everything we got within us, we're learning all the time. So if we can be role modeled this way of being, it's a much nicer way. I mean, how many people do you know who have been wronged by somebody and they hold on to this bitterness and resentment and vengeance for so long, and you can see it eats away at them. They can't see it themselves because it's just their natural state of being. And you can be sitting there talking to a friend, maybe just chit-chatting, everything's okay, and then maybe like their ex might phone up or something about the children, and their whole demeanor changes. They get tense, they get that look in their face. They often look older, and just they have like a bitter look on their face, and it's actually quite sad to see. I've left a partner, and at one point I hated him, but at the time I think the hate was healthy. It got me out of the relationship. I didn't like what was happening. I got to the point where I actually despised him. But the opposite of love, is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. So I allowed myself to get to that part of indifference and forgive him for all the wrongs he did me, because I couldn't I would have been like Nelson Mandela. I would have walked away from an abusive relationship. And then if I would have held on to the hate, who is that affecting? The only person that would have been affecting is me, because he's over living in another house, doesn't know I'm hating him. It affected me, and that's what people carrying hate or resentment or this vengeance with them, it's only affecting you and your soul.
It is. And I guess your decision to walk in forgiveness means you can leave the past behind. You can learn from the past. It doesn't mean that everything happened just stops, because we learn from the past and we take the transition that we walk through with us. But it means you don't take the past into the future. You can have a clean slate in the future and be open to what the future is holding for you as that new person, but without that resentment and bitterness coming with you. But Jo, for listeners that are tuning in to the podcast or watching us on YouTube, what are those tools? What are the key strategies for people that haven't understood the process of forgiveness, who suddenly listen to this and think, gosh, I actually thought forgiving was letting them off the hook, was saying it was okay. I didn't realize it was about me. I thought it was more about them. So I want to actually release myself from that cord that goes between the two of us that I've hung on to all this time. I want to set myself free, but I don't know how to do it. How do we do it?
Okay, well, first of all, it's understanding that you are forgiving for you. It's for your own growth, your own happiness, and your own peace. And we often have to forgive without an apology or without an acceptance of guilt or wrongdoing. So that is often the case. And I think the first tool is accepting all of your feelings that you've had. Accept that you've had rage or bitterness or vengeance, or you might have wanted that person to explode in a ball of flames. Accept that to begin with, because that's all okay. You're human. Accept that. And then commit to letting it go. It has to be a conscious choice. Like you said before, the definition is, like, psychologists will generally define forgiveness as a conscious, deliberate decision to release feelings of resentment and vengeance towards another person or group.
And do you have to wait until the other person has said sorry to do that?
Never. Because as I just said, you might be waiting until hell freezes over before that happens. It may never happen. I mean, how many times have you fallen out with somebody and they have never admitted their guilt? But again, life's two sides to every story anyway. This is all about doing work on you for you. So definitely not. No.
So there's levels of forgiveness, aren't there? Because if somebody comes to you to say, you know, I can understand I really hurt you by saying this, would you forgive me? And then you can partner with it and say, yes, of course I forgive you. Thank you for that. It did hurt me, but I'm prepared to let you go. Let's be friends again. So that's one level of forgiveness, which is probably easier, isn't it? Because then you have an understanding that what they did was actually wrong because they've admitted it. That's an easier step. But what you're saying here is, regardless of the fact that they can come forward and ask for forgiveness or admit they've done something wrong, you do it anyway. You make that conscious decision.
Because what you've just said then, of course, if somebody comes to you and if there's two people coming together to have a conversation which is calm and in good spirits, well then of course it feels better, because both of you get to talk about your feelings and how the situation made you feel. And so if the other party is coming to apologise, of course that's a win-win situation generally, and yet that is definitely easier to forgive. It doesn't take anywhere near as much courage. Well, actually, it depends on the situations. That's actually not true. But if the other person's there, of course, it can often be easier. However, in a lot of situations, that's not the case. And, you know, we're talking about forgiveness for really big things sometimes as well. You know, you just talk about that couple and that hideous, hideous, hideous thing that they went through. Losing a child. I mean, it's bad enough losing a child in any set of circumstances, but to go through what they went through, that's gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. So, but they found it in them to do it. If they can, anybody can. And take that glimmer of hope. That's your seed. They did it, so you know you can. So, yeah. Accept the feelings and then commit to letting go, and be empowered that it is a conscious decision by you for you. And then think about the pros and cons. Think about what it is doing to you by holding on to all of that pain. And do you want to feel like that? Ask yourself that question. By holding on to this amount of resentment, by holding on to this incident that's happened in my life, is it giving me any good?
Or is it diminishing the power that you have to walk out your life in abundance of what the universe has got for you? And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we lack forgiveness, when we won't partner with forgiveness, what we're doing is looking at the past and we're saying, it could have been this, it should have been this, it would have been this. But you have to let that go and say, it wasn't and it didn't. And so now I've got this new opportunity to co-create with the universe, with new people in my life, and to move on with something better than what was, because our mind would step into fear and say, well, that was something that should have been, and therefore that's where I should be right now. But the universe might be saying to you, actually, I've got something way better for you. That was your learning. That was your teacher. And if you learn those lessons from that, I can take you here, which is much further than you would have been if you'd just gone on that journey and that path. So, and again, going back to the couple in prison, their whole life then became purposeful and they were fulfilled, and they loved every minute of going into prisons and working with young adults who had a chance to turn their lives around through restorative justice. And they blossomed in their calling, which was to go into prisons and work with young men. And they found purpose again. And they said, actually, in the end, they'd had 2 sons. They had 1 living son still remaining. But they semi-adopted emotionally, psychologically, all these young men in prison who hadn't had good parenting, hadn't had good role models. And they all fell in love with this couple who became like grandparents to them, and they had their mentors in prison, so they felt a sense of purpose. So not only can we forgive, but we can take that to another level, and we can actually find purpose through that forgiveness. We can bring good somewhere else, and that is if we want to realize that there's a higher purpose and a higher being outside of ourselves, isn't there? It's not just about us, our needs, our wants, our ego, our desires. It's something bigger than where we're at, actually.
But if you want to just think about yourself and your ego and all of that kind of stuff, if you are going to hate on somebody, you are giving them your power. So just remember that while you are in hatred and bitterness and vengeance, you are not keeping your power to yourself. You are handing it over to that other person. So even if you are in that state and you're feeling a little bit bold and you're thinking this forgiveness stuff isn't worth it, you just handed over your power. So think about that.
Yeah. And as Oscar Wilde says, if you don't want to forgive as well, remember that if you forgive your enemies, nothing annoys them more.
I know. So there's actually other reasons to forgive if you actually can't think about our beautiful reasons. There you go. So yeah, so what have we said? We've said accept your feelings, commit to doing it. No, feel empowered by that. It's your choice. Ask yourself what it is achieving by holding on to the pain. How is it making you feel? And then you've got to find some empathy somewhere as well, I think. You know, you've got to empathise for people and yourself, because sometimes this is not about just forgiving some other people. This is a whole list about forgiving yourself as well for anything. You know, we're very good at beating ourselves up for things we've done wrong. So it goes with everything. Empathise for yourself, have empathy for other people, and understand your responsibility in the situation.
Yeah.
Because we all have a responsibility somewhere, even if we've been wronged. Accept that was where it was, and focus on the present. Focus on what it is you want your life to look like. Do you want to live in all of those horrible words, which makes your soul feel heavy, or would you like to live a little bit lighter? And as you say, you know, forgiveness doesn't mean you forget. That's not what it means at all. It doesn't mean you are okay with what's happened, that you condone it. That's not what it means at all. It's just letting go of that for you. And allow peace to enter your life and feel compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so powerful what you say. I like to say the way you've read them without saying number 1, 2, 3, 4. You haven't given the list like I do every day. Very clever. I love it. But also, do you know, interestingly, when we don't forgive, what we often want from the person is love. That's the thing we're searching for from that person. We want them to understand how we feel. We want them to say that I really cared about you. We want them to say I didn't mean to hurt you. We actually seeking love. So we're looking for love outwardly. If we turn that around to forgiving them and releasing them, we can then find that love inwardly. And we can say that they hurt me, that's their responsibility. My reaction is my responsibility. Therefore, we step into ownership about the part we have to play. You've just talked about the different parts that we have to play and the ownership we take. They've hurt me, that's theirs. They've got to deal with that. My responsibility is my reaction, my anger, my rage, my insecurity, my bitterness, my jealousy. So I'm going to work with that. I was looking for love from them and reaffirmment and security, but I'm actually going to find that inside me. I love myself. I can actually forgive myself for my reaction. I'm going to go on a new journey because of this situation. I'm going to grow. And that's when we take back our power and we become an authority in who we are, and we learn to love ourselves again, isn't it? We find purpose, we find meaning. And interestingly, we find freedom and peace.
Absolutely. And I mean, aren't they just beautiful words, freedom and peace? I'll just leave you with one last quote. It says, "Let no man pull you low enough to hate him." And that was by Martin Luther King Jr. Let no man pull you low enough to hate him.
And wouldn't it be lovely to know that when somebody does pull us low enough, we instantly start to say, I'm going to rise above this. I am going to rise above this, and speak those positive words. You and I talk constantly about changing our thought patterns, changing our words. And that's such a lovely quote to leave us with. Say that one again before we go.
Let no man pull you low enough to hate him, because you are worth more than that, and your life is worth more than that. You are beautiful, you are wonderful, and forgiveness is all for you and your heart. So from our hearts to your heart, we're going to leave you with love, light and peace. Thanks so much for being with us today. For us to inspire others to live their magnificently imperfect life, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or on your podcast app. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Pods with Posh and Pool. We can't wait for you to join us on our next episode. Love, light and peace.